Jim, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a privilege to be with you, Tom.
I have to say, this is a podcast that I've been looking forward to, arguably more than any other. I came across your work in about 2017 or 2008. It was right about the time Living an Examined Life came out. So I
Mhm.
was listening to you on a podcast, and I remember very, very vividly you speaking about this idea that every single morning we have to wake up and we have to I suppose, dance with or overcome two little gremlins that are at the foot of our beds, and one is fear, and the other one is lethargy. And to me, what I liked about that so much was it's this is often this idea that we all have to face, that if only we could just get this thing done. If I make enough money, or if I speak to this person, or if I finish this project, then life will be okay. And already worded in that wisdom, you say, look, it's every day you have to wake up and face these two gremlins. So I suppose I wanted to start there. Jim, talk to us about your journey and what it was like for you to face those two gremlins prior to then becoming a psychoanalyst. What was your life before this life like?
Well, that's a very large question, sir. Um, First of all, those two gremlins, as I call them, I want to personify them, are pretty universal. A number of years ago, I was rereading the Odyssey and found to my dismay or to my enthusiasm that the various trials that Odysseus had to go through with his men trying to get back home broke down into those two categories. The things that were intimidating, such as the Cyclops, and the clashing rocks and so forth, were terrifying. And one of the messages we all get in childhood is the world's big and you're not, and the world's powerful and you're not. So how are you going to cope with that for a few decades? And secondly, is the lull back into sleep, into naivete, into avoidance, which we face every morning, and the Isle of Circe and the Isle, the eating lotus eaters were every day they would get stoned and so forth. You see, those two temptations to say, oh, it's just too much for me on the one hand, or let me find some way to stay unconscious, asleep,
Mm.
or not at the wheel of my life. Those are pretty universal. And they show up in my life every day. I'm not always thrilled to get up in the morning and get to work or do whatever I have to do, but life calls, and death is a very long time. So I think we need to be here as best we can while we're still here. So,
Mm.
I could point to a lot of experiences in life which were tempting to avoid the difficult tasks that lay ahead, or on the other hand, felt intimidated by things. I'm still just an ordinary human being, so I'm not immune to being intimidated by things. But then on the other hand, if you live a fearful life, it's a diminished life, and something inside of each of us knows that. And one of the questions I ask clients frequently to say, when you reach a juncture in your life, when you have to make some choice, where no matter what you do, it's going to be difficult for you, you have to ask the question, is this path an enlarging path for me, psycho-spiritually speaking, or is it a diminishing path for me? And intuitively, you know the answer to the question, even before you answer it. Or secondly, if you don't know, keep asking it and it will make itself clear to you. And choose the path of enlargement. I've also said to folks, and nobody's thrilled to hear this, often in life you have to choose between anxiety and depression, and people think, oh great, I thought you would have spared me those things. But anxiety rises out of entering the new territory, especially if you're moving out beyond your comfort zone, but something inside of you wishes to take you there. And on the other hand, depression is what happens when you don't show up in your life, where life has been pushed down by your own collusion. And so you can't avoid either anxiety or depression, but anxiety, the path of anxiety is a path of enlargement, the path of stepping into the larger journey that I think your soul is asking of you.
Let's speak to the soul there. I know that people would probably hear that word. Some people, I suppose, and see that it comes, I suppose, with a lot of baggage. There'd be people out there that are quite religious and quite spiritual and hear
Mhm.
that. And have a particular understanding as to what that means for them. When you say the word soul, what do you mean, Jim?
Well, first of all, it means it's the literal translation of the Greek word psyche. So the soul is the totality of our being, our organic nature that's seeking its own expression in the world through us. But in a very conventional way, I think it's whatever is most deeply true about us, whatever that life force in us is seeking. You notice I'm talking about that force that is seeking its expression through the world rather than what I want or what my parents wanted for me or what my culture seems to pose as desirable for me to want in my life. And so when you could do all the right things, and I was one of those persons at midlife who'd done all the right things and had achieved more or less all my life goals by the time I was in my early 30s. And I remember being shocked to wake up depressed and
Mm.
to ask myself the question, as anybody would, how quickly do I get rid of this depression? It's kind of like being in a hole, and the tool that got you there is the shovel. So you think, well, I better work harder, and you do a little bit more, and and the hole gets deeper. And so that's what took me reluctantly, I must ask, um, to my first hour of therapy. And I didn't know I was beginning a different kind of journey that led me into a different profession and a different life journey, but it was. And something inside of us knows us better than we know ourselves. And when we violate that, or when it's violated or oppressed by forces in our environment, we pathologize. That is to say, we express this suffering through our symptoms of some kind. And so I ultimately had to realize I'd been asking the wrong question, not how do I get rid of this depression, but ask, why has it come? Why has my psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval of and support from the executive decisions my ego consciousness has been making for me? And a lot of those decisions were good decisions, to marry, to start a family, to have an academic career, and so forth. But there was also something else that needed to be addressed. And a lot of it had to do with childhood issues or trauma and so forth. But a lot of it too, I think, was stepping into a journey that was, as I said, larger than was comfortable. And you can resist that a good part of your life, but again, that's dealing in what Jean-Paul Sartre said is mauvaise foi, bad faith. Something inside knows that, and so we become fugitives in our own journey, and that's unfortunately, that what we are modeling to our children or to
Mm.
our parents or to our colleagues or whatever. So again, none of this conversation is about ego gratification, nor is it about serving the culture's values. It's what is wanting expression through me. Another way to put this, and it's very simplistic, but I think there's some truth to it. In the first half of life, you have to try to figure out what the world wants from you and meet their demands. What do my parents want? What does the school teacher want? What does my partner want? What is the culture asking of me? And try to figure out a way to manage that as best you can. Second half of life, assuming you've done what most people do, and that's a shoddy job of that, but it's still the world you've created in some fashion. You then have to say, but why am I here really? And who am I apart from my roles? That's a different question. And then you begin to ask, all right, a altogether different question is not about what about is going to, quote, make me happy, but what fills my life with meaning and purpose? And that's not something I invent. That's something that I experience from within. If I'm doing what's right for the soul, then the soul is going to be supportive there through the feeling function, through the energy systems that we have. And our dreams, for example, will be supported. But most of all, you will experience this as a meaningful way to live your life.
Mm. God, there's so much there. You mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre, and I only put a little trill at the end there because I spoke French back in
Hmm.
high school.
Sure.
But one of the most famous existentialist quotes was "Not choosing is still a choice," which I think is so pertinent, especially for this day and age when we have access to so much choice and we're sort of paralyzed by that. When all throughout the years that you've been working as a therapist, and especially after you actually worked through your own therapy, do you
Mhm.
see the modern world as it currently stands much harder to listen to your soul? I remember on a recent podcast you said you're not what happened to you, you are what's trying to actualize or speaks through you in a way.
Mhm.
Is it harder to listen to those voices based upon the way the current world is, or has it always been quite difficult, would you say?
Well, I think it's always been difficult. It's been difficult in different ways. For example, most of human history, individuals have been tasked with simply trying to stay alive, to stay, have food on the table, to avoid whatever is harmful in their environment. It's also true whenever you have a family of origin or a culture or a religious tradition that defines who people may be and restricts them in very specific ways. I mean, gender roles, for
Mm,
example, are very constrictive. And when my parents were young, there were clear definitions of what a man was and supposed to do and not do, and what a woman was and was not supposed to do, and so forth. That's been loosened up in many ways. I mean, we live with a certain degree of cultural relativism now in most places of the world, not all of them. But you know, there's a freedom to that too. So I think in some way it's easier to chart one's own journey. It's intimidating again, perhaps, or we're seduced by the lull of distractions. But you're less here. I don't think the message is as strong as when I was a child. You're here to fit in. You're here to sort of belong to the consensual reality, you see, because that began to be seriously deconstructed in the 1960s in particular. And I don't see us going back to that. There are always regressive forces in your culture or in our own psyche. But I also think this is a kind of opening for a fuller humanity if people are willing to take on that responsibility, and not everyone is.
mm. Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? I remember reading Otto Rank when I was getting really into psychoanalysis, and he spoke to this idea that you essentially have two fears. You have life anxiety and death anxiety, akin to sort of being pushed, not necessarily guided by
Mhm.
anxiety and depression. It's really, really, I've noticed this in my own life as well. It's so hard to take that anxious path, but I like how you're describing it. It's what's the other choice? It's like you're just sort of waiting around until you pass. The
Mhm.
the responsibility to choose your own life and become who you are. I wonder whether in this day and age it's more of a distraction. I'm just kind of staying on on this path at the moment because I get a lot of um, people and questions, and this is something that I'm often questioned by as well. What is my own path, and what am I really supposed to be doing? And I wonder what some of the external factors and forces are that are holding us down from that or making it more difficult. Do you think it's distraction now more than say when you were growing up, those restrictive gender roles, or what are some of the other factors that are at play?
Well, you mentioned distraction. I think that's a critical piece to this. And by the way, as far back as the 17th century, Blaise Pascal was saying the chief difficulty of humankind in his time was the inability of a person to stay by themselves for a single hour a day by themselves and to tolerate that presence. And he said even the court had to invent the jester because even the king and queen with all their privileges and access to the material bounty of their time and place will grow miserable if they reflect upon their own souls. And he said, therefore, we invented the jester, whose purpose is divertissement, diversion. Now, that diversion has been ramped up a thousandfold now with the internet and so forth. We're wired 24/7, and people become addicted to that distraction. What is it we're being distracted from? That's the question, isn't it?
Mm,
That's the existential question. What is it I'm being distracted from? And Pascal was no stranger to this. He said once in his Pensées or Thoughts, the silence of these infinite spaces terrifies me. That's in the 17th century.
wow.
So learning to be present with yourself and the great silence, so to speak, and to be able to hold to something until out of that emptiness, something begins to emerge for you. Because as I said before, there's always something inside of us that knows us better than we know ourselves and is seeking its expression in the world. Now, on a literal level, let's say, and this is very literal level, let's say a person has a particular talent and that's not valued in their time or culture or their family. And so they feel intimidated and unwilling to undertake it, or they feel there's a certain kind of journey they have to make. And by that, I mean more of a psychological journey than a physical one, but it could involve leaving home, leaving family, leaving the familiar world. And what if somebody doesn't show up? There's a little poem by Rilke in which he says, a man's eating his meal with his children, and he hears of a shrine in the far west, or far east. It would have been Russia at that time when
Mhm.
Rilke was writing. It was the frontier to a person in Prague. And he said, so he leaves on his journey, and his children grieve his loss. But there's another man at the same time who hears of that same shrine, feels the call to visit, but he stays there because he's intimidated. And then his children have to make that journey for him.
Mm.
Now that's Rilke writing a little over a century ago, you see. When Jung said the greatest burden the child must bear is the unlived life of the parent, that's what Rilke was intuiting there. You see, it's like we absorb messages, we observe models, we internalize that. Most commonly, we repeat those models. That's how these patterns ripple from generation to generation. Or we sense there's something limiting there and we run in the other direction. So every time the person says, well, I'm certainly going to get away from my mother, or I'm not going to live my father's life, I'm still being defined by that other, you see. The third path is to recognize those influences because they're there. Am I going to repeat it or just be running from it? But then I have to pay attention to what is asking its expression through us again. Now, that's not always an easy task, obviously. I was an academic in my early life, and it was rich and valuable. I valued teaching. I still do, or we wouldn't be talking today. But I also came to realize as a result of my therapy, I had used the life of the mind to distance me from very painful feelings that were going on inside of me. It wasn't a federal crime, but it was in some way a denial of what needed to be addressed. And so, ironically, I was brought back into that world. Now, when I was a child, as many children would, I thought, well, maybe what I want to do is be a professional athlete when I grow up. Well, I didn't get the body for that. I had the hope for that, but not the body. And so unconsciously, and it was unconscious, I always loved learning, still do, but it was sort of like I over-identified with that, thinking that that was the pathway to understanding. If you find enough wisdom in your life, if you read enough good books, you'll find the secrets of life. And there's much to be learned from those sources, to be sure. But it also was, in a way, my form of distraction. It was my way of avoiding going into the belly of the beast, so to speak. That's why I think my own psyche reached up at midlife and pulled me down there. Just as a quick example, I'd had a lot of health issues when I was a child. And so I thought I would become a physician at first, besides a sports figure. And then without making a conscious decision, I left for the humanities in academia. And I came to realize then later in my 30s, I was as part of my internship, I was working in a psychiatric hospital. And I began to realize, isn't it interesting that the world that was fascinating but terrifying to me as a child, my own psyche unwittingly has pulled me back into that world.
Mm.
Here I am in a medical situation dealing with emotionally disturbed individuals in a state psychiatric hospital, and all things could be seen there, and including the depths of human suffering and pathology, and yet I found it profoundly meaningful. And there was a time when I was still in academia, when I was shuttling back and forth between a university campus and the psychiatric hospital, and I could compare the conversations going on in a single day. And I began to realize that the conversation in the hospital was somehow more real, more engaging, more frightening at some level, but more compelling. And slowly I began to realize my own psyche was shifting its identification to doing that kind of work. And I couldn't have imagined as a child, given the impulse to escape that world, to go back to it and spend my days listening to people in emotional distress. But, the psyche had an agenda of its own that ultimately the psyche really had to work hard to knock on my hard head, I think, to get me to stop and pay attention. Because whatever it is we're avoiding is playing a huge role in the governance of our lives. It's nothing wrong about being fearful. That comes with the human condition, but it's wrong to live a fearful life ultimately, because that again keeps you within your own, constricted world. The mind-born manacles of man, as William Blake called it, you see. Those are the constrictions we put upon ourselves. And at some point, you step into your journey, not necessarily knowing where it's going to go, but knowing that you take the next step and the next step until something begins to become clearer to you.
Mm. Why psychoanalysis? When you moved away from academia and you started to
Mhm.
do your own therapy, of all of the ways in which you could practice therapy, why was it psychoanalysis that spoke to you?
Well, it was specifically, although I learned a lot from Freud, it was a Jungian analysis that
Mm,
drew me to study in Zurich at the mothership, so to speak, at the Jung Institute there. And first of all, it takes you deeper than most psychologies do. Most psychology, and I say this with respect, I utilize these tools myself, but you know, behaviorism and cognitive psychology are sort of task-oriented, problem-solving kinds of things that can be helpful to individuals. I don't denigrate that at all. But if you want to go deeper into the meaning of your life, your journey, that's a different kind of voyage. And I think only psychoanalysis begins to really approach that. Jung said once, this is not about curing, because we're not a disease. It's just that it's about growing into your journey. And he said the pathway is the approach to the numinous. And the numinous comes from a Latin verb that means to nod or beckon. So it's something that touches you very deeply. You don't invent it with your consciousness. It's something that moves you. And when you're moved in a deep way, then there's some kind of resonance that occurs within you. And it engages the spirit in a way, the energy that is here to serve life, you know. I mean, we can mobilize our energy, and we do, to get up and feed the baby at 3 in the morning or to tend to the tasks of civilized life, all of which is important. But in the end, if you keep mobilizing energy in the wrong direction, it leads to burnout, leads to exhaustion, leads to self-medication, it leads to depression, as I experienced. So something within us quickens, and then we know that we're touched by something that's important for us. It could be intimidating again, but it is something that our life is calling us to address. And when we do that, there are forces within us that support us in that journey. There's a sentence that Jung said that I think about almost every hour in the daily life, because of given my work, and that is, he said, we all have to find what supports us when nothing supports us. I mean, that's profound, and it's
mm,
also intimidating.
mm,
It's also a mystery. What supports you when nothing supports you? That is to say, when your outer world is not something you can just continue to take for granted, or when important people in your life are no longer there, or that position that you expected in life is not available to you, or whenever there are substantial encounters like that where the outer can no longer be sustained, or wasn't the place you needed to be in the first place. Then you need to find that there's something in us, a resilience, I guess, that rises to the surface and says, okay, I'll just take this next step and see where it's going. When I went to Zurich, I'd started analysis in the United States, but then I realized if I'm going to really do this, I'd like to go into it as deeply as I could. So I went to Zurich, and um, I found at first I wasn't planning to change my career. I wasn't planning to change other important issues, but that came as a natural conversation that was rising from within by working with dreams and so forth. Most people say, well, I don't dream, or dreams are just what, happened the day before. Well, that's because they really haven't had the experience of working with them. I'm now 84 and a half, and I recently learned that if we live to 80, 6 years of our life will be spent dreaming, not sleeping, but dreaming, which is extraordinary. So why does the psyche spend that much time,
Mm.
processing our life, and not just processing it, but commenting? Because yes, it speaks to us in an elliptical language, a symbolic language. But as Jung pointed out, he said this is a language our ancestors knew because they lived in a world where it was not just atoms bumping up against other atoms. It was a symbolic world where there was an interiority to life, an interiority to nature around us, and so forth. And he said, if you pay attention, you realize that there's an intelligence there that is seeking a deeper dialogue with you, the attendance upon which leads you to get that sense of personal authority. Now, we have it when we're children, but we're tiny and we can't execute it. That authority you can call instinct, for example. But we trade away necessarily our innate desires for life to fit in, to meet our needs as best we can in our relatively powerless way until we lose contact with that source within us. And that's what has to be recovered for each person. People have often said, parents, for example, how do I spare my children all this Sturm und Drang here and this stress that they have to go through? And I said, you really can't. It's like you have to go into life and build enough ego strength and have enough life experience to look at it, to be able to sort of look back on this and say, well, what was going on there when I made that decision? And where did that come from in me? I often ask that question in therapy. Where do you think that choice came from in you? And often it came from an old fear-based place, came from an old codependence, for example. It wasn't coming out of their own depths or their summons to a deeper life. It was coming out of an adaptive strategy, which is understandable given that our whole first half of life was, donated, given, dedicated to fitting in, as I said, staying out of harm's way. But in the long run, that is deceptive. It's about stepping into what is fearful and to understand ultimately, and you don't get there without taking that risk, that something then will be supporting you from within you. And when you do that, then your personal authority moves from the outer world and trying to integrate that into people's appropriate responses to recognize there's something here that tells me what is right for me. And then I have to mobilize enough courage and intentionality and discipline to live that through.
I suppose the idea that there's something within us that is more powerful, more aware, ever present, uh,
Mhm.
trying to make itself manifest, it can be quite a confronting idea, especially when you've been born into a culture that tells you that you are the center of the universe, and that the whole goal, whether you're playing the game of status or beauty, is to make yourself the biggest, make yourself the center. What are some ways, Jim, in which people can start to lean into navigating the internal life? Because I imagine it's quite confronting for people to just take a full dive in there, and almost, you know, um, almost have that existential crisis be unavoided, or suppose that psychosis if you're not careful with it.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, sometimes it is necessity when you have to do that. And that's sort of what prompted my depression, I think, and my ultimate reaction to that. Because I first went to a psychiatrist who wanted to medicate it. And I tried that, and I found it was just numbing me. It wasn't doing anything else for me. And with the best of intentions, I'm not judging his decisions, but that's when I started analysis. And I think this takes, first of all, a deep dedication to purposefulness in your life, number one. And you don't get that through the blandishments of modern culture, as you were implying when we began. All right, if you think that house or that relationship or that new car, that latest shiny object is going to do it, go ahead and do it. People make that mistake every day, and we don't see the results there as anything that's very satisfying for very long. And underneath this is not about narcissism. This is not about self-absorption, because you're right. We live in a culture of narcissism. It's all about you. Well, it isn't. In the first half of life, you're serving what the world demands of you, or running from it as best you can. In the second half of life, you have to ask a different kind of question, and namely, what is life asking of me, and what is worthy of my service? See, that's a different kind of question. Because if you don't keep asking that, and I emphasize that word service, because it's not about making the ego comfortable. I don't find myself being comfortable in the psychoanalytic hour with an individual, but I find it meaningful. That's a big distinction, because in some way, none of us knows quite what's going on. You know, Jung used to say when he got a dream, I don't know what this means, but together we're going to converse around this and get the associations that rise for you about these images in your dream, and begin to see some of these layers peel off, and you begin to, in time, realize, holy cow, or some word like that. There's something in there that's speaking to me. And that's the critical piece. I could give you tons of dreams from clients if we had the opportunity to illustrate the moment when a person began to realize these dreams are not just random. There's something there that is really meaningful, and it's seeking to communicate its perspective. You can put it this way. He said, if there's like a 2 million-year-old person inside of you, a sage, and wouldn't it make sense to talk to the sage once in a while and see what that has to happen? Now, in our culture, where it's all about getting plugged into out there, this sounds crazy, right? But it isn't. It's actually what has been known through the centuries for those who have had a deep dialogue around the purpose of life itself. In the outer world, it's interesting because I had occasion about 15 years ago to be teaching both the Sumerian Gilgamesh and the biblical book Ecclesiastes, and both of them are dealing essentially with the absurdity of life. You're here a short while, and then you die. It's an absurd proposition, and therefore, what is of value? And each one of them came up with the same set of priorities. Whatsoever thine hand finds to do, do with all thy might. In other words, throw yourself into what life brings you. Love and care for those whom the gods have set at your side. And thirdly, always remember and respect the gods. Now, translate that into modern language when you say respect the mysteries. You know, respect the fact that so much of what we do is coming from some deep place. It's really an affront to consciousness that wants to think itself the boss. Consciousness itself has to execute important outer decision. You stop your automobile at a stop sign, and you try to live in an ethical and consistent way, of course. But in the long run, consciousness is a tiny wafer floating on a large ocean. It serves its purpose, but it also has to remember how tiny it is and how vulnerable it is, how easily invaded it may be by intrapsychic material, and respond out of the old conditioned responses. That's what Jung meant by complexes. A complex is neither good or bad. It's simply a cluster of our history that has a lot of energy attached to it. People have this notion you lie on a couch and you complain about mom and dad somehow. Well, it's not about that is not at all the case. But when you stop and think about where were my first lessons about self and other and the nature of the traffic in between, it's going to go back to childhood. And in those moments, you begin to see your elemental capacity. We're all spread out along spectra here. Do I trust the other? Do I distrust the other? Can I approach the other? Do I need to keep my distance? Is the other going to be dependable, reliable, or uncertain? Are they going to be invasive or punitive? We start making up stories based on what our childhood experience is, rising from the fortuity of those earlier autonomous experiences. And so we get attached to our stories because we are an animal that needs to have a narrative to understand, what am I to understand about the other in my life? So we develop patterns of compliance, for example, or we develop patterns of avoidance and staying away. And we have trouble risking being open. And how we feel about ourselves is often a function of what we've been receiving from the world around us.
Mm.
And those are the child's stories. In other words, one of the hardest things in therapy to truly integrate is to understand I'm not what happened to me, because we all tend to assume that I am what's happening to me around. And children are scarred by poverty, disease, alcoholism, war, and so forth. Terrible as those events may be, they're outside here. They have little to do with the individual soul of that child, but he or she will internalize that message as somehow a kind of imposed narrative about this is who you are and this is what your life agenda is going to be about, at least a part of it. Same is true with the family of origin. So we have to sort of ferret out what are these clusters of energy within us that, when triggered, have the power to come up and usurp the ego. And I've used the analogy many times. You wouldn't turn your automobile over to an 8-year-old. You'd say, well, you're not old enough to drive the car. But the 8-year-old story inside of us is making decisions for us on a daily basis.
Mm.
And that is something, if you don't know that, then you're driving your automobile of life unconsciously. Spend some time really examining that. And you begin to realize how many, if you go deeper and deeper and deeper, how many of those decisions were fear-based or were in a sense trying to accommodate or fit in with the other or something like that. Not terrible things, but inauthentic things. That's the point. And many of them are in service to our narcissistic needs. Now, we can't help but have narcissistic needs, but when they show up in our outer life, then we're accountable in terms of how they influence our children, our partners, and so forth. Many parents, for example, are expecting their children to grow up and sort of surprise, be like them, the parent, right? Endorse their values. If they're going to marry someone that they would approve of and endorse their political or religious values. What is that but the adult's unaddressed narcissism that gets dumped on the child whom they profess to love and care about, and yet burden them with those kinds of messages overtly or covertly all the time. So again, the best thing I can do for my children is pull that stuff back and own that. Or in intimate relationship, my sense of self, my sense of purpose in life, my self-esteem is not something that my wife is supposed to fix. She's here to live her journey. I'm here to support her journey, and she supports my journey. And the more I impose upon her these expectations of finishing my unfinished business, the more burdened she will be. So the loving thing to do is to take that on myself. You see, in the abstract, it sounds simple, but in practice, it's very difficult because we have to first of all recognize that's what we've been doing, is imposing on our children or our partners or whatever our unfinished business. And to own that takes courage and insight and discipline over time. But it's possible to do that. And then we become less and less a burden to people around us.
Mm. Jim, growing older is something that I also think our culture really struggles with, we mentioned
Mhm.
status and beauty
Mhm.
and this idea of rising to the top and having it all as opposed to accepting the fact that it's all eventually and slowly and always going away and eroding. Just as a personal example, I'm losing my hair, and I'm
Mhm.
I'm I'm noticing that a lot of stuff is coming up for me around that area, you know,
Of course.
and it's been interesting, but it's also been a beautiful exploration to see me losing my hair as a journey of trying to accept all of the many other things I'll lose in life as I grow older. When you're working with people who are growing older and are transitioning to later life, what are some common things that come up for them?
Well, interestingly enough, a good number of my practice at this point, the great majority, in fact, are people who are 60 and over. So we're dealing with the loss of people that they love, care for, dealing with changes in the body, loss of powers that they might have had in the past. And yes, each one can feel like a defeat or a large wounding experience. And at the same time, it can also invite a person to wrestle with this question. So who am I really? Am I these functions? Am I these appearances? What is my journey about really? I went through some serious health issues rather recently, as recently as a year ago.
Mm.
I had two cancers and two large spinal surgeries. So there was a serious question about whether I was going to live or not. So my wife and I moved to a retirement community to have some structure and hopefully people around her if I would disappear. And so I'm glad we did. At the same time, it's all around me in a very obvious way, you see. And then you have to recognize that our journey is not about having it all, but it's disidentifying with having it all, right? What is it about, you see? What is your life journey about? Now, that purpose varies depending on the stage of the journey. I mean, there's a time for the child to learn how to move these arms and legs in a coordinated way, or learn to walk, or learn to step into the world, learn how to hold a job and show up on time. These are important outer tasks that we need to address in order to become a functioning adult individual. At the same time, we are not our roles and we are not the functions we once have. We are somehow a spirit. I find myself as curious today as I was as a child. When Jung wrote his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and towards the end, when he's asked, it was through an interview system, what do you think are the most important things you've learned? He says, I can't really speak about anything really, because who knows what's true. He said, what I can say two things. One is in some way, I'm the same spirit I was when I was a child. And he's at that time, I think about 84 years old. Well, my age exactly. And he died at 86. And he said, I also feel that something has carried me from the beginning through this journey. And I think that's profoundly humble. And it's something that I would identify with because I would say similarly, there's no grand truths that I wish to articulate. I would rather say it's all a blooming mystery. And when you forget that, that is what is most profoundly important, I think, about being a human being. And you need to ask yourself, how am I to be in the presence or in this life, understanding from whence I came and whither I go are mysteries. People may have beliefs about that or speculations, but that's at best what they are. No one knows. These are mysteries. And to know that one has actually been here in a way that mattered, in a deep and abiding way, that's important. And to have loved people and lost people along the way, you see. So a person can be defended against the losses, but then they're also defended against the richness of relationship too. That's the paradox. If you're not going to love, your life is going to be sterile. But if you do, that love is at risk. So there's your paradox. And the larger life is found in the risk of investment in life, you see, and not the defense against it. So, life continues to be an unfolding mystery. I find it more and more interesting. I will say about the modern internet, I find it an enormously educating tool. It's marvelous to look up pieces of information in the past you might have just sort of speculate. I wonder where that came from, or wonder what that means, or what is that idea about? Well, you can get it within seconds now, you see. That's a marvelous tool. On the other hand, as we know, the internet's used for 1,000 distractions. It's one more shiny thing to take you away from you, which sort of tracks us back to where we started here, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's also a lot of joy in, I remember, driving to, my mum would drive me to school. This is obviously, I was quite young, not a couple of months ago. And, we'd talk, this was pre-Google. So we'd talk about, oh, I wonder what that flag is. We'd always drive past this house and there was this flag and we never knew what kind of flag it was. And there was so much joy to be found in just not knowing and talking about what it might be. And I almost feel sometimes that when you can look it up, it gives you the answer, but it takes away the mystery of that is
Yeah.
found between point A and point B. So, but blessing and a
Mm.
curse, I suppose, Jim. Um, you've got a new book coming out. I'm so excited to read it. When can we expect it to be out and about?
Well, it's in March of 25, yes. And in the first chapter, it has a title taken from the poet Charles Bukowski. And he says, find what you love and let it kill you. And this is the chapter title of an essay on happiness. Now, I want to quickly say I have nothing against happiness, but people think the goal of life is to be happy. Well, go out ahead and try, see how that works for you. If you're thirsty, a glass of cold water makes you happy for a moment. Happiness is contextual. Happiness is transient. And to be in a permanent happy state, you'd have to be psychotic or so narcissistically absorbed that you ignore the injustice in the world or people right around you who are suffering in some way. So if you want to be living like a stone in some way, that's a devotion. But even then, it becomes a kind of an addictive search for that high that you think is happiness. It's not about happiness; it's about meaning. And so I thought Charles Bukowski's sentence, from a poem was apropos. Find what matters to you and matters so much that living it hurts in some way, but that hurt is so meaningful. That's why I've always thought learning and working with people suffering is in some way, if you're a sensitive or feeling type of person, then it's virtually painful to you. But at the same time, what can be more meaningful than being part of the journey that somebody's going through, you see? So I can't say I'm happy doing my work, but it makes me happy to do the work. That's the paradox here, you see. And I'm continuing to do it at this point because I don't want to lose that meaningful connection in my life. And I'm not seeing as many people as I used to, but I think those conversations go deeper than conversations normally happen in our life. And so that's a richness that rises out of the experience somehow. So I think you to get back to the book, and I also try to provide some tools there about, active imagination, which are ways to work with dream images, dreams themselves. And there's a chapter there on trauma. There's a
Mm.
chapter there on the problem of evil. And that's all that I remember right now. There are about a dozen essays, but it's a collection of essays, is what it is. And by the way, the title is Living with Borrowed Dust,
I
which is a
love that
line.
title so much. I have to say that.
It's a line from the poet Stanley Kunitz, who says, he wrote this on his, I think it was 79th birthday, and he lived to 101.
Mm.
He said, I'm living with borrowed dust, and what you borrowed, you have to return. So ashes to ashes and dust to
Mm.
dust. So
Yeah, yeah. I just can't wait to read it. like I said, I came across your work when Living an Examined Life came out. Swamplands of the Soul was very helpful. And just in general, Jim, you have helped me so much, both personally and professionally. There's lots of things that you have said, whether it's in a book or on a podcast, that I'll recommend people I work with to dive into further. So thank you so much for being you, and I cannot wait to hopefully do this again, especially when the book comes out.
All right. Well, I can say, and I experience here that this work you're doing with your podcast is part of your mission, part of your summons to be engaged in life in a way that is meaningful to you. And so, see, that's not narcissism, that's service to the world, but it serves you as well. And that's the win-win that comes out of that. So it's been a privilege to talk with you, and I wish you and those watching today well in their journeys.
Thank you so much again, Jim.
You're welcome.